All right. What we at 7 and 8. Let's see what happens. Chapter 7. The walls of the old house creaked as the wind swept outside, echoing the storm inside Ricky's mind. At 15 years old, he'd already seen more of the world's darkness than most grown men. His father, drunk as usual, was passed out on the couch, with an empty bottle rolling on the floor beside him. The man's snores reverberated through the small, dilapidated house, mixing with the faint rattle of the windows. Ricky sat on his bed, staring at the old backpack he'd stuffed with everything he thought he might need. Some peanut butter crackers, a flashlight, a few crumpled bills he'd lifted from his dad's pocket, an aged, yellowing letter, and an old baseball cap Mr. Calloway had given him. The cap was more than a piece of cloth. It was a prize, a hard-earned trophy from hours of study and dedication at the chessboard. Ricky's plan wasn't perfect, but he was determined. Across the street, at the edge of a weedy, overgrown lot, sat Mr. Norris's old, rusted-out Chevy Nova. Ricky had watched the car sit untouched for months, hood coated in grime and tires half sunk into the dirt. But it still had plates, and he'd overheard old Joe bragging to the neighbor that the engine would still work like he wouldn't believe. Ricky didn't know much about cars, but he knew enough to turn a key and press the gas. A starter swap here and an oil change there. With his dad, that was a rarity. It always ended with cussing and tools flying. He glanced at the clock. 2:02 a.m. It was now or never. Slinging the backpack over his shoulder, Ricky crept to his bedroom window and slid out, the old frame groaning softly. He froze, his heart pounding. His father's snores didn't let up. Ricky hoisted himself out and climbed down, landing softly in the yard. The morning air was cool, and his breath came out in quick puffs as he darted across the street to the Nova. His palms were sweaty despite the cool air as he tried the driver's door. Unlocked. Ricky grinned despite himself. He'd been counting on old Joe's carelessness. Sliding in the driver's seat, he crouched low and felt around under the dash. Mr. Calloway had once shown him how to start a tractor without a key. Red wire, blue wire, cross until it sparks, he muttered to himself. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the wires. Finally, the engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. The sound seemed deafening in the still night. Ricky's stomach clenched as he glanced back at his house, half expecting to see his old man stumbling out the door, shouting his name. But the house remained dark and silent. He shifted the car into drive, his feet barely touching the pedals, and he rolled out in the street. That old Nova growled as it picked up speed, but it moved, and that's all that mattered. As the town's flickering streetlight disappeared in the rear view, Ricky felt a strange mix of fear and freedom wash over him. He didn't know where he was headed, maybe towards the highway, maybe towards the state line. All he knew is for the first time in years, he was in control. The road stretched ahead, dark and full of uncertainty, but Ricky smiled. The engine grew louder with every press of the gas. For the first time in years, Ricky was free. As he neared the county line, Ricky's mind raced. What would happen when his dad woke up and found him gone? Would he even notice? Part of Ricky doubted it. His dad had hardly paid any attention to him for years, except to yell or blame for something. The thought stung, but Ricky shook it off. He wasn't going to let that man control him anymore. Surely no one would be around this late, he said to himself. He had no plan and very little money, so he pulled over under a huge oak tree just before the county line. He killed the car and sat for a moment to collect his racing thoughts. What if he was pulled over? He could explain taking the car to escape the sheriff, but what proof did he have? How long did someone decide to search the mine, if ever? With Mr. Calloway gone, where was the paperwork saying that the land belongs to anybody? If Sheriff Heath and Deputy Clark already went to such lengths, what would keep them from forging a deed? The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, but also full of possibilities. The stars were faint, blurred by the occasional passing cloud, but Ricky found himself staring up at them every few minutes. He didn't know much about constellations, but something about the endless sky above made him feel small in a way that didn't hurt. For the first time, being small didn't mean helpless, it meant being free. He stopped thinking about the stars and focused on the car. The Nova wasn't perfect. It rattled when he hit a bump, and a smell of oil hung thick in the air. But it was all he had for now, and it was literally his only way out. After what felt like hours of deliberation, Ricky tried the wires again. A spark, a grinding noise, a click. Again, a spark, a grinding noise, a click. The sound was familiar, but Ricky's knowledge of auto repair was limited at best. He wished now he'd paid more attention when his dad had explained things, amid the cussing and purping while tinkering under the hood. Ricky figured the starter was what got the car going, but that was about the extent of his expertise. With a reluctant sigh, he decided to crawl into the car and look for something that seemed like it might be a starter. Chapter 8. Okay, Mr. Norris. Okay. I'll let the sheriff know. Yes, sir. Deputy Clark hung up the phone and stared at it for a long moment, his thoughts spinning. Joe Norris wasn't the kind of guy to overact. But that didn't make sense. Ricky? Stole his Nova? That didn't sound like the Ricky he knew. 2:07 a.m. The station was quiet, kind of silence that made every little thing sound louder than it should be. The buzz of the overhead lights hummed in the background, and the old building creaked now and then, as if settling back into the earth. Clark sat back in his chair, rubbed the stubble on his jaw as he thought it over. Should he call the sheriff? He knew old Heath hated being woken up unless it was something serious, and Ricky, well, Ricky was trouble, but not that kind of trouble. Skipping class, throwing rocks at trains, weaving his bike in and out of traffic. Oh yeah, Ricky was reckless, but stealing a car? That didn't sound like him. But then again, old Joe seemed pretty sure of himself. Clark sighed. He grabbed the phone and dialed the number almost without thinking. Ring. 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 Yeah, came the sheriff's voice, rough and groggy. Hey, Sheriff, it's Tommy, and I don't want to wake you up, but, Clark hesitated. How's he going to explain this? But what? Well, sir, it seems that Ricky has stolen Joe Norris's Nova, sir. For a moment, there was silence on the line. Clark could practically hear the gears turning in Heath's head, the sleep fading as the sheriff processed the words. Joe Norris's Nova? Heath repeated, his tone sharp now, all trace of sleep gone. You sure about this? When did it happen? Did Joe see him? Which way is he headed? Deputy Clark explained everything that old man Joe had told him. He claimed he'd seen the car with his own eyes tearing out of his driveway, like it was a getaway scene from a movie. I'll be there in 5, Sheriff Heath said before hanging up abruptly. Clark sighed, letting the phone drop back in his cradle. Outside, the night seemed warm and still, the air thick and heavy. It was like holding his breath. In the distance, he thought he heard something, a low, distant rumble. Perhaps a car engine? He shook his head and grabbed his keys, muttering, Ricky, what the hell are you thinking? By the time the sheriff's truck rolled into the parking lot, Clark was waiting by the cruiser, leaning on the hood with his arms crossed. The car idled soft behind him, its engine the only sound in the quiet lot. Heath climbed out of his truck, tugging his hat into place as he walked over. His eyes were sharp despite the early hour. You think that kid's dumb enough to drive that car through town? Clark shrugged, exhaling slowly as the weight of the situation rested on his shoulders. He's dumb enough to throw rocks at moving trains, so yeah, maybe. The sheriff gave a humorous laugh, shaking his head as he climbed in the driver's seat of the cruiser. Well, let's hope he hadn't gone too far. The last thing we need is a kid in over his head behind the wheel. Clark slid in the passenger seat, his face set as Heath turned on the scanner. Static crackled over the radio as the sheriff steered the car out of the lot and onto the empty street. The headlights sliced into the darkness, but it still felt like the night went on forever. Somewhere out there, a kid was behind the wheel of a car he had no business driving, and Clark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end well. I just hope we find him before someone else does, Clark said, staring out the window at the endless black. Sheriff Heath didn't respond, his grip tightening on the wheel as he focused on the road ahead. The silence in the car was thick, weighted with unspoken concerns. Somewhere out there, Ricky was making choices that could change everything, and not in a good way. That's chapter 8.